On May 28, 1987, the massive expanse of Red Square in Moscow was surrounded by the physical and political power of the Soviet state. Then, out of the sky, a small, rented civilian aircraft descended over the cobblestones and came to a stop just a few hundred meters from the walls of the Kremlin. To understand how shocking this image is, you have to realize that the airspace above the Soviet capital was guarded by an integrated defense network designed to repel a global nuclear strike. It was universally considered the most heavily fortified sky on the planet. The pilot who bypassed that network was an 18-year-old named Mathias Rust, equipped with a basic flying license and barely 50 hours of flight experience. Rust's arrival in the heart of Moscow proved that a hobbyist plane could navigate the very defenses built to stop a fleet of strategic bombers. This public failure left the Soviet military leadership vulnerable to a type of internal political pressure they had never faced before. In the mid-1980s, the Cold War had settled into a tense, frustrating stalemate. Following the collapse of the 1986 Reykjavik summit between the US and the Soviet Union, attempts to negotiate nuclear disarmament had frozen completely. Inside the Kremlin, Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev was trying to push through sweeping arms reduction treaties, but he faced intense, unyielding resistance from the conservative old guard of his own military. Those hardliners drew their political power directly from the Soviet Air Defense Network, a billion-dollar matrix of radar installations, missile batteries, and interceptor squadrons. This system was notoriously lethal. Just 4 years prior, in 1983, when a commercial Boeing 747 known as Korean Airlines Flight 007 strayed over Soviet territory, interceptors shot it out of the sky without hesitation. Rust approached this incredibly aggressive defense matrix in a rented Cessna 172, a slow-moving, 4-seat propeller plane roughly the size of a family car, entirely lacking military hardware. What happened next was a collision between an ultra-rigid military hierarchy optimized for World War III and a painfully simple anomaly that the system literally lacked the vocabulary to process. As Rust flew east from Helsinki and crossed over the Baltic coast into Soviet airspace, military radar operators briefly picked up his signal, only to lose track of him almost immediately. This quadrant graph explains why, plotting speed against altitude. The system is calibrated to detect targets high in the right quadrant, fast incoming military bombers. But Rust's Cessna crawled along the bottom edge. Flying low and slow, it continuously slipped underneath the calibrated threshold. Eventually, Soviet border guards spotted him visually, scrambling 2 massive Sukhoi Su-27 fighter jets that successfully pulled up directly alongside the tiny propeller plane. The fighter pilots radioed the visual confirmation down to ground control, asking for instructions, but the officers on the ground hesitated. Terrified of sparking another international incident, like the downing of the civilian airliner 4 years earlier, nobody issued an order to fire on a non-hostile target. The jets were recalled. The strict top-down chain of command that defined the Soviet military had paralyzed it. Because the threat was unscripted, no officer was willing to take personal responsibility for a decision. As the Cessna pushed deeper inland, the tracking completely unraveled due to a simple clerical error. Air traffic controllers briefly detected a civil aviation signal and falsely assumed the unidentified contact had safely landed at a regional airport. This map of Moscow reveals Rust's incredibly rudimentary navigation method. With no military avionics to rely on, he simply used a tourist roadmap, tracing the winding line of the Moscow River directly into the dense center of the capital. Down the low, pedestrians stared up in utter confusion as this low-flying, unfamiliar aircraft descended slowly over the heart of the city, assuming it was part of an airshow. Decades of engineering, thousands of radar dishes, billions spent on electronic warfare had been entirely neutralized by a teenager navigating by eyesight and a piece of paper. Soviet security forces arrested Rust moments after he stepped out of the cockpit, leaving the highest levels of the military command staring at an inexplicably empty net, entirely devoid of an excuse for the breach. Mikhail Gorbachev converted this public humiliation into a political tool. He used the military's obvious failure to challenge the authority of the hardliners who had spent years obstructing his push for reform. Looking at this diagram of the Soviet military hierarchy, we can see the sheer scale of the resulting purge. Within days, Gorbachev fired the defense minister, the commander of the air defense forces, and over 300 senior military officers in a single sweeping stroke. With the core of the conservative military resistance abruptly dismantled, Gorbachev suddenly possessed the political runway he needed. He moved aggressively to sign the historic arms reduction treaties that had previously been deadlocked. For 40 years, NATO's strategic planning aimed to counter the Soviet military through force and deterrence. Yet it was an 18-year-old in a rented Cessna who eventually provided the political opening to dismantle the resistance that had kept the Cold War at a standstill.